In 1595, a young Ottoman prince ascended to the most powerful throne in the world. But his first act as sultan wasn't a grand conquest or diplomatic triumph. It was something far more sinister. Picture this: 16 silk cords, 1 palace, and a single night that would haunt an empire forever. What Mehmed III did to secure his crown was both legally required and morally unthinkable, turning his greatest victory into his deepest curse. But here's the twist you won't see coming. The very act meant to save his empire may have actually destroyed it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more shocking stories from history's darkest chapters. The blood was still warm on the palace stones when the young Prince Mehmed first stepped into the throne that would become both his destiny and his curse. It was 1595, and the Ottoman Empire seethed in an era where death stalked the corridors of power like a hungry shadow, whispering promises of betrayal in every gilded corner of Topkapi Palace. The dense air of Istanbul carried the perfume of spices from the Orient, but also the metallic scent of fear that had settled in the heart of the world's most powerful empire. Mehmed III did not yet know that he would be remembered not for conquests or wisdom, but for an ancient law that would transform his ascension to the throne into a family bloodbath that would echo through the centuries, staining the very foundations of his dynasty with innocent blood that would never wash clean. The Ottoman tradition was as cruel and implacable as the desert that had witnessed the birth of their ancestors. Fratricide was not merely permitted, it was encouraged, viewed as a political necessity that guaranteed the stability of the empire. "Let him of my sons who inherits the sultanate kill his brothers for the good order of the world," declared the law of Mehmed the Conqueror, carved in marble and blood into the consciousness of every sultan who ascended the throne. It was a cursed inheritance that passed from father to son like a hereditary disease, corrupting souls and destroying families in the name of political stability. Young Mehmed, at 29 years old, knew these words by heart, but never imagined he would have to transform them into action with his own hands, becoming the architect of a massacre that would haunt his dreams until his dying day. When his father, Murad III, closed his eyes forever in January 1595, Mehmed felt not only the pain of loss, but the crushing weight of a crown that seemed heavier than laid upon his head. The palace harem, which housed more than 1,000 women, whispered conspiracies in corridors perfumed with rosewater. Each concubine who had given birth to a prince saw in her child's eyes not merely a son, but a possibility of power, a chance to see her bloodline rule the world. Mehmed knew that among these women were serpents disguised as devoted mothers, ready to poison, bribe, or kill anyone who stood between their children and the golden throne that gleamed like a deadly sun in the center of the palace. Every smile was potentially treacherous, every gesture of affection a possible prelude to betrayal. The political mathematics of the Ottoman succession were brutal in their simplicity. With 17 potential heirs to the throne, the empire faced the constant threat of civil war that could tear apart everything their ancestors had built over 3 centuries. Each prince represented not just a person, but a faction, a collection of supporters and sympathizers who would rally to their cause if given the opportunity. The mothers of these princes were not mere concubines, but political actors in their own right, women who had spent years cultivating alliances, gathering intelligence, and positioning themselves for the moment when their sons might make a bid for supreme power. The harem was not a peaceful retreat, but a battlefield where wars were fought with poison and intrigue rather than swords and cannons. Mehmed understood that the law of fratricide was not the product of arbitrary cruelty, but of hard-earned wisdom written in the blood of previous civil wars. The Ottoman Empire had seen brothers fight brothers, witnessed the devastation that succession disputes could bring to a realm that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Red Sea. The law had been created to prevent the kind of prolonged succession crises that had destroyed other dynasties, to ensure that the transfer of power would be swift, decisive, and final. But understanding the political logic of fratricide did not make the prospect of implementing it any less horrifying for a man who still remembered playing childhood games with the brothers he would now be forced to kill. The first night as sultan was the longest of his life. Mehmed walked through the royal chambers, feeling the weight of each step echo through the marble walls like the beats of an agonizing heart. His 16 younger brothers slept in their rooms, unaware that dawn would bring not the light of the sun, but the cold gleam of blades that would seal their fates. The oldest was only 11 years old, the youngest still nursing at his wet nurse's breast. They were children who played with wooden soldiers and dreamed of adventures in distant lands, not knowing that their own lives had become pieces in a deadly game where only one could survive. In the innocence of their sleep, they looked like angels, their faces peaceful and trusting, unmarked by the knowledge of the fate that awaited them. The Grand Vizier approached at dawn with downcast eyes and trembling hands. He was a man who had served 3 sultans and watched the empire grow like a giant tree fed by blood and ambition. His words fell like stones into a deep well. "Your Majesty, tradition must be fulfilled. The princes represent a threat to the stability of the empire. Each one of them is an open door to civil war, a seed of discord that can destroy everything our ancestors built." Mehmed looked out the window toward the Bosphorus, where merchant ships arrived laden with treasures from around the world, and knew knew that this wealth, this power, this grandeur depended on a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The irony was not lost on him that to preserve an empire built on conquest and expansion, he would have to begin his reign with an act of destruction that would consume his own family. The silk cord was the traditional weapon for Ottoman fratricide. To die strangled with silk was considered an honorable death for princes, as it did not shed royal blood and preserved the dignity of the imperial family. Mehmed held the soft fabric between his fingers and felt as if he were touching the very soul of the empire. The silk came from China, had traveled thousands of miles along the Silk Road, passed through the hands of Persian and Arab merchants, crossed deserts and mountains to arrive there, and become the instrument of the most terrible family tragedy in Ottoman history. 16 silk cords were prepared at dawn, each one soft as a caress and deadly as a serpent. The executioners who would wield these instruments of death were chosen not for their cruelty, but for their loyalty, their ability to carry out orders without question, even when those orders violated every human instinct. The palace executioners moved through the corridors like black-clad ghosts, their steps muffled by Persian carpets that covered the marble floors. They were men chosen for their absolute loyalty to the sultan and their ability to execute orders without questioning, even when those orders tore at the heart and challenged all human instincts. Some were mute from birth, others had had their vocal cords cut to ensure they would never tell what they had seen. They knew every corner of the palace, every secret door, every hidden passage that allowed access to the prince's chambers without alerting the guards or the nurses who cared for the children. Their expertise in silent killing had been honed through years of service to the throne, but never before had they been asked to use their skills against children, against the very blood of the dynasty they served. The first to die was Prince Mustafa, 11 years old, who slept embracing a wooden horse painted in bright colors. His eyes opened for an instant when he felt strange hands touching his neck, but there was no time to scream or call for help. The silk cord tightened like a deadly embrace, cutting off breath and life in a matter of seconds. His small body shuddered once, then lay still forever. The wooden horse rolled across the floor, its painted eyes seeming to weep invisible tears for the innocence that had just been sacrificed on the altar of political power. In that moment, the palace ceased to be a home and became a mausoleum, a monument to the terrible price of absolute authority. One by one, the princes were silenced in the darkness of dawn. Osman, 9 years old, who collected colorful stones from the palace garden and dreamed of becoming a great explorer. Ahmed, 7 years old, who could recite entire verses from the Quran with the angelic voice of a devout child, who had shown such promise as a scholar that his tutors predicted he would become one of the great Islamic theologians of his generation. Bayezid, 5 years old, who still called for his mother when he woke in the middle of the night with nightmares, who was afraid of the dark and slept with a small lamp burning beside his bed. Each death was a small tragedy, a life interrupted, a future cancelled in the name of political stability. The palace that had been built to celebrate the life and power of the Ottomans was transformed into a silent mausoleum where the echo of the children's last breaths mingled with the cries of mothers who would never see their sons again. The younger princes died without understanding what was happening to them, their minds too innocent to grasp the concept of political murder. But some of the older boys awakened in time to see death approaching, to understand in their final moments that their own brother had ordered their execution. The look of betrayal and incomprehension in their eyes was something that would haunt Mehmed's dreams for the rest of his life. These were children who had looked up to him as their older brother and protector, who had run to him with scraped knees and childhood sorrows, expecting comfort and safety. The trust in their dying eyes transformed into accusation, creating a wound in Mehmed's soul that would never heal. The concubine mothers of the murdered princes were awakened by each other's screams of despair. The harem, which had been a place of subtle intrigues and elegant competitions, exploded in lamentations that pierced the night like sharp knives. Women who had been rivals embraced in their common pain, weeping tears that seemed to wash the golden marble of the palace with a rain of suffering. Some tried to throw themselves from windows, others tore their hair and ripped their silk garments in gestures of primitive despair. The scent of sandalwood and roses that had always perfumed the harem was replaced by the salty aroma of tears and the acrid odor of mourning that settled like an emotional plague. These women, who had spent years plotting and scheming for their son's advancement, now found themselves united in a grief that transcended all their former rivalries and ambitions. The psychological impact of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate family. Palace servants who had cared for the princes, tutors who had taught them, guards who had protected them, all found themselves grappling with a trauma that challenged their understanding of loyalty and duty. Many of the palace staff had watched these children grow from infancy, had celebrated their first steps and first words, had taken pride in their accomplishments and worried about their health. Now they were expected to continue their duties as if nothing had happened, to serve a sultan who had just murdered the children they had loved and protected. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation led to an atmosphere of psychological fragmentation that would persist throughout Mehmed's reign. Mehmed spent the following days locked in his chambers, unable to eat or sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of his little brothers, heard their childish voices calling his name, felt the weight of their small hands touching his face, place in innocent games. The golden throne that he had desired for so long now seemed made of ice, burning his skin every time he sat down. Courtiers whispered through the corridors that the Sultan had gone mad with remorse, that he spoke to himself during the night and screamed the names of the dead in nightmares that never ended. The absolute power that should have been his reward had transformed into a prison of guilt from which he could never escape. The crown he had secured through murder felt heavier with each passing day, its weight a constant reminder of the price he had paid for it. The irony of Mehmed's situation was that he had committed the murders to secure his throne, but the guilt from these acts made him a weaker ruler than he might have been otherwise. The decisive, confident prince who had ascended to power was replaced by a haunted, indecisive sultan who second-guessed every decision and saw potential betrayal in every advisor's counsel. The very act that was supposed to eliminate threats to his rule had created the greatest threat of all, his own psychological deterioration. Ministers who had expected to serve a strong, ruthless leader found themselves dealing with a monarch who was increasingly erratic and unpredictable, whose judgment was clouded by guilt and paranoia. Foreign ambassadors who visited the Ottoman court were shocked by news of the massacre. In European courts, where competition for power was also fierce, the execution of 16 children in a single night was seen as an act of barbarism that stained the empire's reputation. Diplomatic letters circulated between Vienna, Venice, and Paris, describing Mehmed III as a bloodthirsty monster, a tyrant who had lost all humanity in his thirst for power. The image of the Ottomans, already viewed with suspicion by the Christian world, was further damaged by a tragedy that seemed to confirm all prejudices about Oriental cruelty. The massacre became a propaganda tool for Ottoman enemies who used it to justify their own aggressive policies against the empire. European monarchs, many of whom had their own complicated succession histories, nevertheless expressed horror at the scale and systematic nature of Mehmed's fratricide. King Philip II of Spain, himself no stranger to political ruthlessness, reportedly declared that such behavior was beneath the dignity of Christian princes and used the massacre to argue for a new crusade against the Ottoman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II ordered special prayers to be said for the souls of the murdered princes, while simultaneously using their deaths to justify increased military spending for defense against the Turks. The massacre had given Christian Europe a moral high ground that they were quick to exploit for their own political purposes. But perhaps most damaging to Mehmed's psychological state were the reactions from within the Islamic world. Many Islamic scholars and clerics, while acknowledging the political necessities that sometimes drove rulers to extreme measures, questioned whether the systematic murder of innocent children could ever be justified under Islamic law. Some pointed to the Quranic injunction against killing innocents, while others argued that the Prophet Muhammad had never sanctioned such wholesale fratricide. Religious authorities who had traditionally supported the Ottoman dynasty found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to reconcile their faith with the actions of their temporal leader. This religious criticism added a spiritual dimension to Mehmed's guilt, making him fear not only for his earthly legacy, but for the fate of his soul in the afterlife. The most ironic aspect of this entire tragedy was that Mehmed III's fratricide did not guarantee the stability it was supposed to provide. On the contrary, the empire began to show signs of decay that would intensify in the following decades. Guilt and remorse consumed the Sultan, who became an indecisive and melancholic ruler, incapable of making important decisions with the necessary firmness. Military campaigns were poorly conducted, the economy began to weaken, and corruption spread through the administration like an incurable disease. The blood of 16 innocents had been spilled to preserve power, but that same power began to slip through Mehmed's fingers like fine desert sand. The very foundation of strength he had tried to secure through murder was undermined by the psychological consequences of his actions. The curse of fratricide seemed to have turned against the empire itself. Following sultans, traumatized by Mehmed III's story, began to question the ancestral tradition. Ahmed I, who ascended the throne in 1603, was the first to break the law of fratricide, sparing the life of his brother Mustafa. This decision, motivated by humanity and horror at recent history, created new political problems and power struggles that further weakened the Ottoman dynasty. The blood of innocent children had been shed to prevent civil wars, but the remorse and change of tradition that followed created exactly the kind of instability that fratricide was supposed to prevent. The empire found itself caught in a paradox where following tradition led to moral corruption while abandoning it led to political chaos. The psychological trauma of the massacre extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the entire culture of the Ottoman court. Palace protocol, which had previously emphasized the close bonds between royal family members, had to be completely restructured to accommodate the new reality that princes were potential threats rather than beloved relatives. The traditional ceremonies celebrating the birth of princes took on a sinister undertone, as courtiers could not help but wonder whether they were celebrating the birth of future victims rather than future rulers. The innocence and joy that had characterized royal family life was replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that would persist for generations. Mehmed III ruled for 8 years, but he never managed to free himself from the ghosts of his murdered brothers. It is said that he ordered ordered the construction of a mosque in memory of the slain children, where every day he sent alms to the poor and paid 16 men to recite prayers for the souls of the princes. But no amount of prayer or charity could erase the bloodstain that marked his reign. The mosque he built, intended as a monument to repentance, became instead a constant reminder of his crime, its very existence serving to keep the memory of the massacre alive in the minds of his subjects. Every call to prayer from its minarets seemed to echo with the voices of the dead children, turning what should have been a source of spiritual comfort into another instrument of psychological torment. The Sultan's attempts at atonement took many forms, but none provided the peace he desperately sought. He established schools for orphaned children, created charitable foundations to care for the poor, and funded public works projects that would benefit his subjects for generations to come. Yet every act of generosity felt hollow to him, contaminated by the knowledge that it was motivated by guilt rather than genuine compassion. The people who benefited from his charity accepted his gifts gratefully, but Mehmed could never shake the feeling that he was trying to buy forgiveness for a crime that was fundamentally unforgivable. His good works became another source of torment rather than redemption, constant reminders of the debt he could never repay. The international consequences of the massacre continued to reverberate throughout Mehmed's reign and beyond. European powers, already suspicious of Ottoman expansion, used the fratricide as justification for forming new alliances against the empire. The massacre became a rallying cry for those who argued that the Ottomans were fundamentally uncivilized and posed a threat not just to Christian territories but to basic human decency. This moral dimension added to the military and political challenges facing the empire, making it more difficult to negotiate treaties, form alliances, or conduct normal diplomatic relations. The blood of 16 children had stained not just Mehmed's conscience but the international reputation of his entire empire. When Mehmed died in 1603, many said it was from heartbreak, consumed by guilt over a crime he had committed in the name of reason of state, but which had destroyed his human soul. His death was met with a complex mixture of relief and apprehension throughout the empire. Relief because his tortured reign had finally ended, but apprehension because the succession crisis he had tried to prevent through murder now threatened to emerge anyway. His son Mehmed I, traumatized by his father's example, would struggle throughout his own reign with the question of how to maintain political stability without resorting to the kind of systematic violence that had defined his father's legacy. The story of Mehmed III became a symbol of the contradiction between political power and human conscience. His decision to execute his brothers was politically justifiable according to the laws and traditions of his time, but morally indefensible by any standard of humanity. He became a prisoner of a tradition that had been created to protect the empire, but ended up destroying the very moral essence of the dynasty it was supposed to preserve. The throne, for which he killed 16 innocents, became a burden heavier than any crown, a constant reminder that some victories cost more than any defeat. His reign served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing political expediency over moral considerations, demonstrating how the pursuit of absolute power can corrupt even those who begin with good intentions. The long-term impact of Mehmed's fratricide extended far beyond his own reign, fundamentally altering the character of the Ottoman dynasty and contributing to its eventual decline. The tradition of systematic fratricide, which had been intended to strengthen the empire by preventing succession disputes, had instead weakened it by creating a culture of fear and suspicion within the ruling family. Future sultans, haunted by Mehmed's example, struggled to balance the demands of political necessity with basic human decency, leading to inconsistent policies and weak leadership that would plague the empire for centuries to come. Today, 5 centuries later, when we visit the palaces of Istanbul and admire the grandiose architecture of the Ottoman Empire, it is difficult to imagine that those corridors of marble and gold were the scene of one of the most terrible family tragedies in history. The echo of tourists' footsteps mingles with the whisper of ghosts of 16 children who died so that one man could be king. The story of Mehmed III reminds us that absolute power corrupts not only those who exercise it, but also those who seek it, transforming them into prisoners of their own ambitions and slaves to traditions they should question instead of blindly following. The most bitter lesson from the story of the fratricidal sultan is that tradition and political reason do not always justify the most extreme acts. Mehmed III believed he was saving the empire by executing his brothers, but he was actually condemning his own soul and planting the seeds of decay that would eventually destroy Ottoman greatness. His reign serves as an eternal warning that some prices are too high to pay, even for supreme power, and that humanity lost in the name of politics can rarely be recovered, no matter how many mosques are built or how many prayers are recited in search of divine forgiveness that may never come. The blood of innocent children, once spilled in the name of political necessity, stains not just the hands of those who shed it, but the very foundations of the civilization that permitted such acts in the name of stability and order. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more shocking stories from history's darkest chapters.